right. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to the State of the Lake Encore presentation. I am Rebecca Hansen, NLRA Executive Director, and this is our, believe it or not, our sixth State of the Lake presentation. Most of you I know are familiar with NLRA, but we work to protect and improve the Newfound Lake and its watershed. We do that in a number of different ways, but water quality is at the core of our work, the health of the lake, and everything that impacts that. We study water quality. We take on projects that improve the health in of the lake and the watershed by conserving land, keeping stormwater pollution out of our surface waters. We protect with land conservation and we also connect with our community through education and outreach programming like we are doing right now. And admitting more people from the waiting room here. In a moment, I will turn things over to Paul, NLRA's Conservation Program Manager, but first, just a couple ground rules. If folks can put themselves on mute, I think that will just make for a more streamlined presentation. And we we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. If you have questions that need answering mid-presentation, pop them in the chat. I will be monitoring that. I'll try my best to answer those. Or if I know Paul is going to be talking about something soon in quick succession, I will let him answer those questions. Or I will interrupt him if I think that does need to, if we do need to break into his process there. So other than that, welcome everyone. And Paul, I will turn things over to you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for that introduction, Rebecca. As Rebecca mentioned, my role at NLRA is our Conservation Program Manager. There's a couple ways that I think about my job. One is kind of I'm responsible for our boots on the ground conservation work that runs the gamut from invasive species to water quality monitoring to stormwater implementation. The other way that I think some of you have come to know my view of my work is that as a resident of Bridgewater, I get to spend my days learning about the place that I live and putting that knowledge to use protecting it. And so State of the Lake is really our annual opportunity to kind of share out the important things that we've seen over the course of a year, the highlights from our work, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in just a couple of slides. For those of you who are less familiar, Rebecca gave an introduction to who we are. We just wrapped a new strategic plan this year. We've got a new facility. We've got a new mission statement that doesn't ostensibly change the work that we do, but I think it better encapsulates what we will be doing moving forward. And so NLRA protects and improves the health of Newfound Lake watershed. We support ecosystem resilience and natural resource conservation through focused programs and that community engagement piece, like tonight's presentation. And part of that new strategic plan is that we have some pretty exciting things on the horizon. We're not going to get into those today, but stay tuned as things unfold. All right, and before we really get into it, I always like to start with a bit of gratitude, and it really does take a whole community to support the work of NLRA, right? So watershed conservation is truly a community effort, and it would not happen without the support of countless volunteers, property owners, municipal partners, scientists from the University of New Hampshire. Big shout out to our state and federal agency staff right now. The amount of data they collect and they manage is what allows us to really do a lot of the work that we do. And it's really thanks to folks like you, engaged community members, NLRA members that support and are interested in our work, that we're really able to carry out that mission to the degree that we can. And there's too many pictures to fit on the slide. And I like this last one because this is what a dedicated community looks like. So last weekend, we just did our third annual Polar Plunge. And if you're willing to jump through the ice to support the work of conservation in the watershed, we're all stronger for it. So a little bit of a roadmap for tonight's presentation. Reoccurring themes for State of the Lake are really our role as humans in the watershed, and a connection between the water quality protection work that we do and that larger watershed conservation mission that we fulfill. Um, Part one, true to form, we'll get into the water quality report, hit some highlights, including what is a watershed. Always start there. Drought. It was really dry in 2025, in case you missed it. So we'll dig into just how dry it is and why that matters to water and aquatic ecosystems. And then we'll do a really brief synopsis of kind of what we saw in terms of lake water quality this year. Um, but I want to kind of move through those two things pretty quickly and save a good bit of time to focus on biology, which is something that we don't often really get into the nitty-gritty of in State of the Lake. And we're going to spend some time to get to know Newfound's latest arrival. That's an invasive zooplankton named spiny water flea. And if that last sentence sounds a bit scary or a bit gibberish, we'll, dig into each of those words. And my hope is that you'll leave tonight's presentation having learned something about spiny water flea and an appreciation for the potential impacts that it may cause. But not just that, but really an appreciation for this whole community of microscopic plants and animals that are the real drivers of the lake ecosystem. Totally uh, underrepresented, underappreciated plankton, both plants and animals. So we're going to get into that in just a moment. And as Rebecca said, plenty of time for questions at the end. So yeah, let's jump right in. All right. So intentionally, we always talk about the watershed concept first. It is integral to the work that we do. So what do I mean by that? Right. And if you were in attendance at our in person, we'd have a conversation about this. But seeing as we're doing it remotely, it'll be a rhetorical question. What is a watershed? And if you were thinking, well, Paul, it's a geographic area that drains to a common point, you'd be right. So when we think about watersheds, traditionally, it is just that, right? It is an area of land whose topography funnels water to a central point. For our work, that central point is typically Newfound Lake, right? And so on an area basis, right, that lake is 4,451 plus or minus acres. That watershed area is vast, right? It's 56,800 plus acres, right? And so it's really important, not only to water quality to recognize how large that watershed is, but also kind of to the scale and impact of the work of the organization, right? In order to take care of that lake, we must take care of that entire watershed. And I think both of those should have equal footing in the work that we do and the mindset of our organization. Um, it is also a naturally defined boundary, right? So as humans, we really like to draw lines on a map, right? And we often will do them nice and straight without any regard to the natural environment. But as a watershed is this naturally defined boundary, it contains whole things, right? Relevant to nature. So it contains whole ecosystems, right? It contains a whole water cycle. It cycles nutrients and it has countless numbers of plants and animals that live out in that watershed. Um, so it's important that we think about not only water quality or one aspect of the watershed when we do our work, but that whole ecosystem. It's also important to recognize that they are scalable, right? So center stage here, we've got the Newfound Lake watershed overlaid by all of these different sub-watersheds that we monitor in our tributary monitoring program, right? So we can really scale this concept depending on the point of interest. So this image here on the left, if you can see my cursor, is my home, my property, right? And so I live here. We can zoom in and see how water interacts with each part of the landscape. And then, of course, going in the opposite direction, the Newfound Lake watershed is part of the Merrimack River watershed, right? And so No matter where you're at, you're really in two watersheds at once. You are standing at the drainage point to a watershed uphill of you, and then you are standing midway through a much larger watershed downstream of you. And I bring this up both in terms of scaling that ecological unit, but then also the importance of scaling our impact on watersheds as well, right? And so this concept allows us to kind of understand our personal impact, our impact as a community, and then a much larger regional impact as well. And lastly, it's not just our ecosystems. It's not that natural component that is contained in our watershed, right? Our lives, our livelihoods, our community, those human dimensions have equal footing as well, right? And so I've always appreciated the work of the Newfound Lake Region Association because we take this very wide, inclusive stance towards conservation, right? Humans are the key players in the natural environment, and I think it's kind of a false separation that we exclude ourselves from conservation efforts, right? And so I think we do a really good job through our community engagement, our stormwater programs at meeting people where they're at, and focusing on that individual component of watershed protection. All right, so as promised, let's review some headlines, right? So 2025 was the driest summer on record throughout the state of New Hampshire, right? On average, about 7.4 inches of rain fell across the state from June to August. And locally, it was even drier than that. So during that same period, we only saw about 6.6 inches of rain. And it's really easy for us to relate to drought as through water scarcity, right? It's something that we kind of instinctually need as animals. Um, but we'll certainly explore the drought through that lens of water quantity or water scarcity. But I also drought can have some profound impacts on water quality. And so we'll dig into some of those as well. And if these headlines give you a little bit of a case of deja vu, it's because we were talking about this last year as well, right? Last year, State of the Lake, we had this crazy comparison between one of the wettest years on record and a deepening drought that persisted through much of 2024, right? And the long-term climate forecast is that our year is getting warmer throughout. Our winters, especially, are warming much faster than our summers, and we're getting wetter winters as well. So our precipitation pattern is shifting to spring and fall and into the winter. And so the occurrence of drought, especially in the summer, is something that I think us as a community is going to have to get used to. Certainly, our ecological communities are trying to adapt the best they can. But this is something that will be a reoccurring theme, I think, in future State of Lakes as well. All right, to illustrate how much or how little rather water we got, I'll kind of go fall back on a pretty familiar figure that has earned a place, I believe, in State of the Lake. And these are going to be year over year accumulated precipitation figures. So before we get into it, I'll just explain what we're going to be looking at. Right along the bottom here, we've got time, so month of the year. And then on the vertical axis, we've got our precipitation accumulation, right? So as time goes on, our line will move from left to right. And as we get rain events, our line will move vertically, right? A big shout out to Steve Gunn, Bristol resident. He is a volunteer precipitation monitor. These are his data. He collects the kind of the best, the highest quality precipitation data out there. And he's been doing daily measurements of precip for over 16 years now, or 2026 will be 16 years. So we couldn't show these images without Steve's dedication. All right, so first line, right? If we were to follow our yearly average, we can expect to see about 46 inches of rain given the last 30 years. And here's where we ended up in 2025, right? We can see right off the bat that we're a little under 6 inches low. If you look all the way over at the right-hand side of the screen. Um, but these images are so powerful because they don't just show you where we end up, but they show you how the season stacks up, right? And so there's a couple major patterns that jump out at me. First and foremost, right, is this very dry spell in the middle of the year from June until September, where we had hardly any rainfall. Um, Interestingly enough, that's not the extent of the drought. We'll get into that in just a moment. But you can see that we entered the year in a deficit. If we look from January to February, we were kind of low in water. And then we actually had a pretty wet spring, which started to bring us out of the drought that had persisted since 2024. Just for reference, here are 2024 and 2023, right? So 2024 was a pretty dry year in and of itself. And then, of course, 2023, you will all remember as the turbulent year where we had, over 25% more rainfall than we normally expect. And we're still kind of seeing the influence of that year in our water quality data moving forward. Highlighted here in red are our large storm events. So these are events where we receive over an inch of rain in 24 hours. This is the water volume, the rainfall rate that can start to cause problems in terms of erosion, sedimentation, stormwater pollution. And you can see that we didn't have that many of them. Certainly in May and April, we had a few to pull us again out of that drought. Um, and then we had a couple in the fall that you'd expect to see some impact from, but we'll get into the drought in just a moment, and you'll see that these storms really didn't contribute all that much to drought relief. So what we're looking at now is kind of the severity of the drought based on the Natural Resource Conservation Service, excuse me, Palomar Drought Index. And so essentially the darker the shades, the more intense drought we see. And again, starting in January, we had a lingering drought from 2024 under our snowpack. We had that spring melt and a couple big heavy rainstorms that kind of eased that drought. Eventually, we got out of it. And from May 13th to August 4th, it's only 83 days, less than a quarter of the year, we were out of drought. And then, of course, this is where we see that impact of that period of little to no rain through the height of summer, quickly getting us into extreme drought conditions in the fall, right? And despite us having some pretty sizable storm events, like these are like 3 to 4 inch storm events, we don't see that kind of drought relief. And typically what happens is when we enter the fall in a drought, and the soils start to freeze and we get snowfall, you don't have the ability for new water to absorb into those soils, right? So drought is really a function of soil moisture. And when there's a snowpack or when your soils are frozen, you don't have that recharge. And so we're actually still in a moderate drought that has persisted really from August until the present. So far, we've talked about drought just in terms of rainfall and a little bit in terms of soil moisture. But let's take a quick look at what drought means for stream flow, and then we'll talk a little bit about kind of the biology and the ecological impacts of drought. So we're going to zoom in on that May to December timeframe, and we're going to be looking at stage height in the Cockermouth River. So again, thanks to federal agency staff, right, we have a USGS gauge in the Cockermouth River in Groton. And so what we're looking at is how high that river is, and that height will respond to different storm events, right? So before we go here, I just want to highlight again these 4 storm events in May and the 2 later on in fall. So here's what it looks like in terms of river height, right? And we can see that that May storm event brought a ton of water in. Now, stage height isn't necessarily equal to discharge, but just for comparison, this May storm, we saw about 1,000 cubic feet per second moving through the Cockermouth River. And these smaller storms entering into June brought between 250 to 500 cubic feet per second, right? Following that, during this dry period where river stage was, below 2 feet, we were seeing weeks on end of flows of less than 1 cubic foot per second, right? And the Cockermouth is a pretty large river. It drains a little less than 30% of the overall watershed. And to have river flows like that, you can expect to see some impact on our ecology of our rivers and streams. As we move and look at some of the storm events that happened out into May or out into October and November, right? We can see that stage heights start to respond, right? And there's a couple of reasons why stage height might be increasing. One is, we finally got some rain. Two is that when the leaves are down out of our forests, right, the watershed's primarily forested, and when those trees aren't transpiring, they're not evaporating water, absorbing it from the soils, we see more of that water in our streams. And so that's kind of what's happening in between our storms here. And we just start to get enough rain before the soils freeze to pull us out of that extreme drought into that severe drought. And we're still in that moderate to abnormally dry spell. All right, and as promised, it's not just water quantity, right? So fortunately, neither of these pictures are from the Newfound Lake watershed. Both are from New Hampshire, though. And when streams start to dry, it can have really negative impacts on water quality and aquatic habitat. Um, Generally speaking, and we'll see this in just a couple of slides, during drought times, water quality in Newfound Lake and lakes in general tend to improve, right? Because we're not getting this flow of sediment and nutrients that we would otherwise see during a wet year. So drought can have some pretty drastically differing impacts on water quality in our streams and our lakes, right? So thinking about our streams, right, that reduced flow has some significant impacts on residence time. So this is the amount of time that water interacts with the soil or substrate in our streams. And the longer the residence time, the more opportunity there is for things to dissolve into that water, right? So we can think about total suspended sediments or phosphorus or different pollutants having more opportune times to dissolve into our water as a result of lower flows and longer residence times. We see higher temperatures and reduced dissolved oxygens. And this is important, right? Because aquatic organisms, just like organisms on land, exist within, a set, they've got their comfort zone, right? They've got parameters at which they tend to thrive at. And when we have low flow conditions, we really start to stress those organisms because the conditions just don't support their lives. Unlike terrestrial organisms, those aquatic organisms can't just get up and walk to the next stream, right? And so we start to see that habitat loss, that loss of connectivity in something that we call dry pooling, which is during drought, we have those last remaining pools of water. And water quality in those pools can get pretty damaging pretty quickly. Drought also has some impacts on soils, making them more prone to erosion, right? They become pretty friable. If you've ever really dried out one of your house plants, you've tried to kill it, and then you've gone and water it, you'll note that that soil kind of breaks apart and the water doesn't absorb into it as readily. And that can happen kind of on the watershed scale and have some pretty significant impacts in terms of erosion. Plants start to lose their fine roots, which means less nutrient uptake, which means that when we finally do get those rain events, we can expect to see more nutrients coming in our streams and our rivers. And then interestingly enough, when it does rain, we can have what's called a rewetting pulse that concentrates all of those nutrients and pollutants from those dry pools into our lake. And that's what these pictures on the right-hand side of the screen are showing. So we actually had a bloom of iron oxide bacteria in the southern end of the lake at the end of September following one of those larger storm events. And that was something that we got out there and sampled. And it was not a harmful bloom, but just one of those interesting connections between our lake and the watershed. All right, so we're going to jump into a quick synopsis of our lake monitoring program, per the name of this presentation. So, quick summary of our lake monitoring program. We've been doing it for a while. We monitor weekly during the summer at 7 different locations. Um, and we measure a whole host of things, mostly physical and chemical properties of water to get at water quality. Um, but we also have watershed sites. We monitor 35 tributary sites throughout 8 major sub-watersheds, and those are monitored monthly through the summer. And more recently, we've been interested in water quality in the nearshore environment. And so I've got a couple slides on our recent work there coming up. Last bit of context for this section of the presentation is lake aging, right? So all lakes want to become a bog, right? As one famous ecologist said, just due to their position in the landscape, they are prone to sediment washing in. And over kind of geologic time, we can see lakes age through this process of eutrophication, right? Newfound is a relatively young lake, despite being over 14,000 years old. When it comes to how much sediment it contains, the nutrient levels, and the biological productivity, we are this young oligotrophic lake pretty securely. Um, Lakes that contain a little bit more nutrient and more sediment will move us further along towards mesotrophic and eutrophic lakes. I've tried really hard this year not to put a whole bunch of graphs in front of you. Um, 2026 marks the 40th year that we've been monitoring the lake, and so you can expect to see lots of graphs next year if that's more of your thing. When we talk about lake water quality, though, really we talk about 3 major parameters, right? We measure water clarity, so how deep we can see into the water. This is kind of one of the most traditional tried and true methods. It's really easy and intuitive to take. And so we've got lots of data on Secchi disk or water clarity, largely deeper values or deeper equals higher values. And so we want higher Secchi depths for better water quality. We also worry a lot about nutrients, especially total phosphorus, right? So this is the lake's limiting nutrient. We can think about what a limiting nutrient is in terms of a car, right? So if you're going on vacation, you've got this wonderfully complex machine that will take you, 1,000 miles at 70 miles per hour, and all you need is the gas, right? And so the gas is the limiting nutrient to your vacation. Total phosphorus is that for the lake. So a little bit of phosphorus goes a really long way to spurring the growth of algae and bacteria and moving us along that lake aging process, right? So we want to limit phosphorus as much as we can. Where does phosphorus come from? In our watershed, it comes from humans, right? We are really good at concentrating phosphorus in through our bodies, through our septic systems, through fertilizers. It comes from erosion in the landscape as well, right? So a lot of people think that most phosphorus would come from fertilizers or septic systems, when in fact, in terms of scale and magnitude, it actually comes from our native soils, right? So anytime that you see soil moving across the landscape, whether that's a road washout or a parking lot, that is phosphorus entering our system, and that is really the work that we need to do as a community to protect water quality. And lastly, we measure biological activity, right? Specifically, this is chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll is the plant pigment that makes leaves of plants green. And so when we measure chlorophyll A, we're actually measuring, phytoplankton biomass. And I'll get into phytoplankton in just a little bit, so hang tight on that. For nutrients and chlorophyll, the lower the number, the better. All right, three more graphs, and that's it. So what I want to show here is that it's really important when we think about lake water quality to think both in terms of long-term trends and short-term impacts. And so each one of these graphs that you can see, the solid line represents the 10-year rolling median for a given year, right? So we're looking at the median values for the preceding 10 years, including that current. And then the open circles represent individual measurements for each of the parameters that we just described, right? So in general, years of drought, we tend to have fewer inputs and have that better water quality. And we can kind of see that in all three of these parameters, right? So just looking up at Secchi depth, water clarity, to start with, right? Right off the bat, that we can go back to 2023. So let's count back 3 years, in case you can't see my cursor. And you can see that all of the recorded measurements at Newfound's deepest site fell below that 10-year rolling median. So we had a pretty terrible year for water clarity in 2023, right? 2024, we can see that we start to have measurements that pull that average or pull that median back up, but we're still in that state of recovery. 2026, we see, 2026 or 2025 rather, we see a more even spread. So we've got more water quality, water clarity measurements pulling that 10-year median back up. So we're improving in the short term, right? The dashed lines that you see take into account every measurement, and they represent the longest term trends. And so in general, water clarity at Newfound's deepest site isn't changing all that much. It might be slightly improving over time, which is good news for us. Over the last 10 years, you can kind of see that that we've seen some pretty significant improvement. On to phosphorus, excuse me, go back. On to phosphorus, right? That long-term average, we see a declining phosphorus concentration. Great. Less fuel for those algae and bacteria. And we can also see that 2023 was a bad year. We had lots of phosphorus above our 10-year median. And then we start to have more measurements fall below that 10-year median. So again, pulling our numbers down towards better water quality. Similar story in chlorophyll. I'm going to not even talk about it because we're going to get into phytoplankton in a moment. The last thing I want to show you is kind of how these numbers compare against each other and against some state standards, right? So the first thing to know is that for oligotrophic lakes, those high quality water bodies, New Hampshire sets its own standards. So we need to be able to see into that lake more than 13 feet, and we want to have total phosphorus and chlorophyll below 8 parts per billion and 3 parts per billion, respectively, right? If we look at Newfound in 2025, we can see that we're more than double that for water clarity, and we're less than half for phosphorus and chlorophyll, right? So Newfound has truly exceptional water quality, even during its bad years. And we're starting to see year over year improvements, right? So we're seeing that good recovery um, from 2023, but we still have some way to go to get lake-wide water quality back to where it was prior to 2023. So we've got a little bit more in terms of clarity to go, and our chlorophyll numbers are still a little elevated based on pre-2022 conditions. Other important headlines that we'll talk about, right? We had spiny water flea detected. So this is that invasive zooplankton. We'll get into the impacts, potential impacts on water quality in a moment. We also surveyed the entire lake shoreline for the third time in a row and did not find any invasive aquatic plants, right? This is big news because when you do have invasive aquatic plants, they really can accelerate that rate of eutrophication and that rate of lake aging. Something that may naturally take on the order of thousands of years can take, tens to hundreds of years to play out. So it's great that we have our dedicated weed watcher community out there doing those surveys, and then we also have people stationed at the public boat launches, engaging boaters. And making sure we're not bringing in those invasive aquatic plants as well. Also, we had no harmful algal blooms reported. Now, I've talked a lot about water quality kind of out in the middle of the lake, and we have been monitoring that again for going on 40 years. And it's really important in terms of tracking that long-term change in lake water quality. Right, we situate those sites far away from the influence of the shoreline deliberately because they best represent the most amount of water. This is really important to do, of course, but where we start to see more change happen is near that littoral community, so that near shore area. And there are, I think, pretty credible anecdotal accounts of our lake shoreline becoming greener, maybe a little bit more slippery on our rocks and docks. And so in 2024, we started a nearshore monitoring program to try to track that, right? And this is some really simple science. We install these clay tiles on people's docks, and then we measure the amount of algae that grows on them as an indicator of biologic productivity. And so we trialed this study in 2024 with 15 sites. We expanded it last year to 24 sites. I've got some grand plans on doubling that number again to somewhere between 40 and 50 sites this year and doing it for at least another 3 to 5 years. But it's really too early for any real results, right? This is kind of a long-term study. But what I can say is that we are seeing differences between sites within years, right? And so the nearshore environment is much more connected to the shoreline environment just uphill of it, right? And so we'd expect to see differences in more developed areas. We'd expect to see differences where we have streams coming in to the lake. And so I'm encouraged that we are seeing these differences within a given year. And then we're also seeing differences across sites over time, right? I'm not going to explain this figure so much, but what we're seeing, if we look at 2024 and 2025, we were able to sample some of the same sites both years, and we saw a pretty significant reduction in algae growth on our tile, somewhere on the order of 40% on average. And so what I take this to mean is, again, dry years, we have less input and our water quality tends to increase. But we saw this reduction year over year. And I think that has something to do with, again, we're starting to be out of the influence of that 2023 storm. And so we're starting to see some signs of full recovery on the horizon. And I think, this data might bear that out as well. So if you're interested, this biologist thinks that it's a great idea, and please reach out if you've got a dock on the lake and you'd be interested in learning more about water quality in your immediate environment. All right, on to chapter 2, spiny water flea. So this was news to us. Spiny water flea has been in the state since 2023, first confirmed in Lake Winnipesaukee, then Lake Winnisquam. We confirmed it in September of this year. And again, invasive zooplankton sounds pretty scary. We're going to provide a lot of context around that so that you as a community can kind of understand those potential impacts and what we can do to manage those impacts. But again, it's not just the impact of one species that we have to understand. It's this whole micro community down there. So what are plankton? We'll start there. Plankton are small microscopic plants and animals that float or drift in open water, right? If you didn't know that plankton existed, you're in good company. I think I knew of them conceptually, but I certainly didn't have any real opportunity to appreciate their diversity and their importance ecologically until we started thinking about spiny water flea kind of on the horizon back in 2023 when it first came to the state. There are two main types of plankton. There are phytoplankton, which are microscopic plants, and there are zooplankton, which are those microscopic animals. So our phytoplankton are comprised of algae, bacteria, diatoms, and if you need any form of appreciation for plankton, I just want you to take a really big, deep breath in and realize that about half of the air that we breathe comes from freshwater and marine phytoplankton, right? So these things are small, but they're mighty and very important to not just a lake ecosystem, but to the whole global ecosystem, right? The fact that we breathe oxygen at all is kind of a result of cyanobacteria evolving the means for photosynthesis, taking that sunlight and turning it into energy some 2.4 billion years ago, right? Um, Phytoplankton are important because they really are the basis of the aquatic food web. They're responsible for about 60 to 90% of the primary production of that creation of energy in temperate freshwater lakes like Newfound. And they're just really cool. I think one of the things that I've really appreciated over the past year is getting to interact with these little critters on a microscopic level, right? So I did not take these images, but these are pictures of diatoms, which are silica-based phytoplankton. And they, again, turn that energy from the sun into sugar. They themselves produce about 20 to 30% of the air that we breathe. And what's cool about diatoms is because they're made of silica, they don't decompose. And so we can look at diatom skeletons in lake sediments to kind of get a sense of how lake ecosystems change over time. Maybe a project for another year. Moving on to zooplankton, our microscopic animal friends. Again, pretty diverse group down there. On average, we can have about 15 to 40 species in our lakes, about 5 to 10 of those being dominant. For comparison, phytoplankton tend to be a little bit more rich as a community, between 50 and 200 species, with about 10 to 30 of those phytoplankton being dominant at any one given time. Zooplankton are really important because they eat phytoplankton, right? So they take that energy that is produced from phytoplankton, ingest it, and then make it available to organisms kind of farther up the food chain. Other reasons why we should care about plankton, besides kind of that primary production engine, the food web foundation, they are really responsible for regulating a lot of kind of the chemical and physical properties of the lake, right? So we talked about a little bit about dissolved oxygen. Our phytoplankton, again, are taking sunlight, CO2, and creating that oxygen in the water that fish and higher organisms depend on. They're also, really responsible for cycling nutrients, and they respond really quickly to environmental change, right? So this is important. So plankton will reproduce on the scale of days to weeks. And so they kind of act as that canary in the coal mine in terms of telling us important information about shifts in temperature and nutrients and climates, and are really important indicators of overall lake health. All right, we're getting to spiny water flea in just a moment, but I've mentioned this concept of food webs a couple of times. And on this slide is really just here to say that lake food webs in particular are pretty complex, right? Life in a lake exists as this network of interrelationships. Um, and for tonight's presentation, we're going to just focus on food chain. But if you're interested where plankton occupy, we see them down here in the food web, and they really, again, form that base of the food chain. All right, so back to spiny water flea. So invasive zooplankton. We describe zooplankton. An invasive species is typically something that is non-native, that will reproduce and grow in a way that supports its own self, and has a competitive advantage over native counterparts, right? So what makes spiny water flea invasive? Well, it's non-native. It's native to Europe and Asia. It's really large. Even for a zooplankton, it's large. So spiny water flea tend to be between an eighth to three-eighths of an inch big, so you can actually see them with the naked eye. And they are voracious, right? So they can really decimate native zooplankton populations, and there's no natural predator, right? They've got a very long silicon-based tail spine, and their size in general makes them a little unpalatable for most fish species. They were first detected in Lake Ontario. They got there through international shipping and the use of ballast water in shipping vessels, and they quickly spread to all 5 Great Lakes. So this is a data set, again, maintained by the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, and shows kind of the geographic spread of spiny water flea. So from 1985, it's moved from the Great Lakes into numerous inland lakes. Currently, its known range includes more than 350 lakes and rivers, spanning 9 US states and 2 Canadian territories, right? And we can see a couple of spots here in New Hampshire, again, Winnipesaukee, Winnisquam, and then Newfound this past year. Prior to coming to New Hampshire, the nearest known sources were Lake George and Lake Champlain, both infested around 2012. And so it took them a few years to get here. We'll talk a little bit about how they spread and the ways they jump from lake to lake in just a moment. In terms of our timeline and our response, right? So we saw the headlines when Winnipesaukee first got spiny water flea in 2023. And so we did some initial plankton sampling with the limited resources we had on hand, which were plankton nets about yay big, yay long. We were unsuccessful in finding anything, which was good news for us. And then in the fall of 2024, we were partnering on a new eDNA study to look for rare species. And the way eDNA works, it essentially is a way to take a water sample and use kind of free-floating DNA, right? Our bodies are always sloughing off dead and decaying cells, just like a fish or a spiny water flea might. And while we were looking for the round whitefish, which is an endangered fish only found in Newfound and the Upper Connecticut lakes in the state of New Hampshire, we also had the ability to look for some invasive species. And so we got an indication that in 2024 we may have some spiny water flea DNA in our water. We immediately reached out to the state and university partners to kind of help us decipher those results. Both said, this result is, or this technique is prone to false positives and false negatives. So you might want to confirm with a physical specimen before going public with that information. And so what that enabled us to do is to really stand up a pretty intensive plankton and eDNA monitoring program. So all through the summer, this past summer, we were out every 2 weeks at all 7 of our lake sites collecting both physical plankton data sets and looking for spiny water flea with eDNA. And we didn't, again, find it until September. But what that allowed us to do was to collect a lot of baseline data on the plankton community, both zooplankton and phytoplankton in our lake. And so now we have the ability to kind of monitor plankton in the future and look back at what our populations were like pre or early infestation. So a really useful tool and great that we were able to get a little bit of a leg up on spiny water flea monitoring. Again, our approach to monitoring kind of combines both traditional and more cutting edge techniques. So here I am with one of our larger plankton nets. And so we have 2 of these different mesh sizes for different sized critters, one for zooplankton, one for phytoplankton and zooplankton. And basically we lower these nets to the bottom of the lake, about 1 meter off the bottom, and then we pull them up and most of the water is sieved out and we can go and look for individual species with the samples that we collect. And then we're also doing that eDNA every 2 weeks. So in 2025, we're really focused on the presence or absence of spiny water flea. We're hoping that we could find it early and that gives us a little bit more time to come up with a management plan. But we are also collecting that important community data. The fact that we were out there searching so hard and didn't find it until September makes me fairly confident in that early detection of spiny water flea. All right, some fun facts on spiny water flea, and this gets back to why they are so invasive, right? So from a life cycle perspective, they can grow pretty quickly and become reproductive females in about a week. They reproduce both asexually and sexually, which is fairly common in zooplankton. So the females will produce clones of themselves. And so this image on the top is a female spiny water flea with a brood sac with at least 3 different individuals, maybe 4 in there. And they can have up to 10 offspring every 2 weeks through that asexual parthenogenesis process. So during the summer, they have this pretty exponential growth rate. When the environmental conditions change, colder water temperatures, less food sources to eat in the fall, they switch that reproduction strategy to sexual reproduction and lay eggs that will overwinter in the lake sediment. And that's kind of how they establish that population foothold. Their prime habitat are deep, clear, temperate freshwater lakes. So Newfound Lake, unfortunately, it fits that description. And yeah, they exhibit that exponential growth. They can outcompete natives. They disrupt food webs. And we'll talk about that now. Right. So in terms of potential impacts, right, we want to think about the roles that our phytoplankton and our zooplankton play in the aquatic food chain, right? So spiny water flea consumes native zooplankton, limiting the prey for native fish populations, right? So this upper image is a spiny water flea next to a juvenile native fish, and you can see that that might be difficult to pass through that fish's stomach tract, right? Um, for larger fish, mature lake trout and other planktivorous fish, they can be a substantial meal, right? If they can get past that spiny barb, we've got pictures of gut contents of large fish just packed with spiny water flea, right? And so they can be a good meal for large fish, but unfortunately, those large fish have to come from small fish, right? And so spiny water flea can have a pretty big impact on kind of the recruitment success of smaller fish into those larger fish. Um, they can also foul fishing lines, right? This bottom picture clearly shows spiny water flea on a piece of monofilament. And this tends to be the way that they get transported from lake to lake. Um, right? Their tail spines can hook onto especially a trawled line, right? If you're using a downrigger and pulling that line through the water, those tail spines and barbs can latch onto that line, and then as you reel them up, they get concentrated. Um, sorry, got a little out of word here. Spine snag lines is one of the mantras in terms of preventing that spread. Um, and it's really fairly easy to take a strong cloth and wipe down your line on a last cast and make sure you don't have any spiny water flea on your line before you reel it up, right? And this is pretty important. It's a easy step to do, but those spiny water flea can live in that kind of moist environment in a reel for a number of days. And certainly cleaning, draining, and drying your boat, which has been the gospel of preventing the spread of invasive aquatic plants, is also really important for spiny water flea, right? If you've got any puddles of water that happen to contain a spiny water flea and you go from one lake to another, there is a possible vector right there. Focusing on the second bullet point a little bit more. So spiny water flea can increase the phytoplankton, the amount of phytoplankton in a lake. And this has to do with that removal of predation from zooplankton, right? I've tried to illustrate that in this image here, right? So in a typical lake ecosystem, right, our zooplankton and phytoplankton exist in balance. The zooplankton consuming phytoplankton keeps their population low. When spiny water flea, the big orange blob here on the screen, comes in, I tried to scale this just so you get a sense of how big spiny water flea are relative to other plankton, right? It eats all the zooplankton. And you release the phytoplankton population from the grazing pressure of those zooplankton, and you would expect to see more phytoplankton growth as a result. And of course, the more phytoplankton we have, the greener our water becomes, and we start to move along that lake eutrophication spectrum. So looking ahead, what can we do? Certainly, NLRA is well positioned to continue monitoring to understand the population dynamics, not just of spiny water flea, but of the rest of the lake's plankton community. It's the thing that's written on my whiteboard over here. We're actively working on that. We are increasingly collaborating with state and university and nonprofit partners. We stand in a position to be able to really kind of collect some really good data and lead the state in terms of understanding the impact of spiny water flea in New Hampshire. But by and large, I think the biggest lever we have in our toolbox is to continue the work in watershed management that NLRA has been doing for decades, right? So If we want to control the phytoplankton population, the best way that we have to do that is through limiting nutrients input into our lake, right? So it's not a direct control on spiny water flea. Unfortunately, there are no known effective biological or chemical controls for spiny water flea, but we can kind of manage that impact on the phytoplankton population by reducing our nutrients into our lakes even more. So this is work that, again, we are well positioned to do as an organization, and we will continue to do into the future. We also have a very big obligation to help stop the spread of spiny water flea, right? Newfound Lake is the largest lake in the state without any invasive aquatic plants. And we have benefited from programs and like the Lake Coast program and the vigilance of other responsible boaters and lake associations. And so now it's our turn to really put out our best in terms of educating the public on the dangers of spiny water flea and how to stop that spread, right? So spine, snag lines. So we're nearing the end of tonight's presentation, just about on track time-wise. And so there's a couple of thoughts that have been kind of swirling around in my head in terms of tying this all together. Right. And so I want you to kind of go back to the top of tonight's presentation and think that, no matter where you are, you're in a watershed. And in the Newfound Lake watershed, we're all connected to working to protect water quality because we're all part of that watershed. Water links us all. We can choose on an individual level to make a positive impact within our watershed. And NLRA is really here as a resource for those who want to do that. And our work and our effort is all amplified when we work together. And lastly, whether it's spiny water flea, climate change, development pressure, the problems that we are facing seem complex, large, and looming. But as an organization, as a community, and as a watershed, I truly believe that we've never really been more up to that task. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to start answering some questions.
So if folks have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, or maybe Paul, you can stop sharing your screen and just take yourself off mute and I'll call on you.
Yep, 1 second.
Nice going, Paul.
Thanks, Herb. Appreciate that.
Bye.
Let's see, stop screen share. There we are.
All right, any questions? All right, well, we are available for questions at any time. So if anything comes up, please reach out to Paul or me. And oh, looks like we have a new chat. Oh, just people saying thank you and grateful for the talk. So yeah, so if folks have questions, reach out to us. This session has been recorded, so we'll make this available so if other folks want to learn more. But we're grateful for all of you being here and your interest. And definitely let us know if you have questions or want to get involved as a host for a nearshore tile or as a water quality monitor.
Great. Thank you all. Have a good night.